To localize the text I display in this application, I'm going to rely on resource files. A resource file is an XML file with a resx extension, RESX, and it stores localized strings for a culture. It can also contain binary assets like images, but to support different languages, I'll need at least one resource file for each language I want to support. The first resx file I create will be the base resource file, and this might have the name like strings.resx. If I want to produce a version of strings.resx that works with Spanish, I'd also create a strings.es.resx. So you can see the language the resx supports, it's embedded in the file name, and we follow a naming convention to describe to the .NET runtime what language and what culture a particular resx file supports. You can also be very specific about the culture, so es-mx would be Spanish Mexico. In .NET, there's a resource manager that will load the appropriate resource file for the current UI culture in effect. But we generally don't have to interact with this resource manager directly because Visual Studio will automatically compile these resources into the project's assembly and also generate code to access the resources with a strongly typed class. If you go to the Properties window for a resx file, you'll see Visual Studio has the build action set to Embedded Resource. We'll also talk about some of the other settings here when we get to the demonstration. To use a resource is very simple. In a view, I can get to a resource with a greeting property inside by going to the generated class and asking for the greeting property. This might return the string hello for English, but it could also return hola if the current UI culture is set to Spanish and a Spanish resource exists. If a resource doesn't exist for the current UI settings, the resource manager will fall back to the base resource. Many pieces of the .NET framework can use resource files. For instance, the data annotations that we used a few modules ago for validation. Instead of hard-coding an error message into the attribute, we can tell the attribute to pull the error message from a resource file. Let's go into Visual Studio and see how all of this works. Inside of the application, I want this greeting to change depending on the user's preferred language. So the first step would be to create a resource file. And one of the decisions you'll have to make when creating a resource file is where to create it, because you can have multiple sets of resource files, and the resource files could live in the web project itself. You could also take all your resource files and put them in a separate class library if you felt that was a better way to manage all the resources that you need. And if I had a resource that was going to be used throughout the application, I might create it right here at the root of the project. But in this case, I have a resource that I think is only going to be used by the index view. So I'm just going to add a new item to the project of type resource file, and I'm going to call it home resources. I expect it's only going to be used by views inside of this home folder. So we will name that home resources.resx and click add, and Visual Studio will create that file in the home folder and open up the resource editor. Resource files are just XML files behind the scenes, and they contain a collection of name value pairs, the resources. So let me create a resource with the name greeting, and the value of this resource will be hello. And I can continue creating name value pairs, but I'm going to leave this file with just a single resource inside for now. And because this home resources.resx file does not have a language embedded in the file name, that means when someone comes to my site requesting a language I don't support, they're going to see this English version of the greeting. This is my default or base resource. One setting I need to change here is the access modifier. I need to change the access modifier to public, and this changes the code generated by Visual Studio to have a public access modifier. It's required because of the ASP.NET compilation model. It turns out our Razor views will compile to a different assembly, and without this public modifier, we won't have access to the class that Visual Studio generates to access this resource. Once I have all my name value pairs in here, then I can come and create the French translation for home resources. So this will be another resources file, but this one will be called home resources.fr.resx, so the French version. And inside of this resource file, I will still have a greeting resource, and now the value will be bonjour. Notice there is no code generation for the .fr.resx file. That's normal. Visual Studio only needs to generate code for that base resource inside of that code, which you can see, by the way, because it's essentially the code behind file for the resx file. This is where all the code is in place to use the resource manager to pull the proper string from the proper resource file. You can see it has a static greeting property, and you can see this class is called home resources, so the same name as the resx file, home resources, and it's in a namespace that matches the directory we're inside of. So odefood.views.home.homeresources.greeting should pull back the proper string for me. Let's give our resources a try. I'm going to come into the index view, and instead of the hard-coded greeting, welcome to odefood, let's output out odefood.views.home.homeresources.greeting, and that should load the appropriate resource depending on the accept header. I can build the application, and let's come out and refresh this home page. And since the last thing we did was configure our accept language to say French, it's going to display bonjour, and everything is formatted European-like. But if I go in and I change in my internet options my languages to move English back up and refresh, I still display bonjour. Why is that? Well, it's not because that the resource files are not working. It's because our cache is working a little bit more effectively than we thought it might. Let's go into the controller. And on the home controller, when we put in this output cache directive, we told it to vary by the param queue, but we're also now changing the display based on the user's accept language header. So I should really say vary by header equals accept language. Now let me perform another build, and what we should be able to do is refresh the home page, and we see hello, and if I come back and toggle this language option again to be French and do a refresh, then we'll be back to bonjour. So now everything is working, the caching and the globalization all working together. And the resource file, by the way, is available from anywhere that you need it. For instance, inside of the index action of the home controller, if we still wanted to place a message property on the view bag, we could say odefood.views.home.homeresources.greeting, and that would also pull the correct resource string out for us. So there is nothing that restricts resource files to views. In fact, there's a few types in the .NET framework that can take advantage of resource files if you point them to it, like the data annotations that I talked about earlier. Let's open up the models folder and look at a review. If I want to customize the error message for this required field, I could hard code a value inside of here, or I could say error message resource type equals, and that would be type of odefood.views.home.homeresources would be the type. And let me take this leading parenthesis off of here, and then the error message resource name would be some additional named resource that we put inside of that resource file. The only one we have right now is called greeting, but that doesn't make much sense to display as an error message.